Hi, and welcome to week 6. We are right now currently in the last couple of days of the midterm. For the most part, I know some of you have already taken the midterm, and as soon as it closes, I will start to grade and evaluate those, although I have taken a look at them, and they do seem to be fairly engaged, and I think you guys have all done a good job of integrating the sources and the materials that have been made available. If you do have any problems, I know I had one email this morning from, I believe, Ryan about some proctor concerns. Please feel free to reach out to me, of course, through Skype, or you can always reach out to me through email or ask your instructor. As far as the readings and things go for this week, you don't have any. So that it's kind of just for the midterm. Traditionally, the midterm would have been open over the weekend. However, because of the holiday, they closed their on the 4th. So instead of kind of the final being open till Friday, which would have taken up the bulk of the time, you do not have that requirement. However, if you do want to get kind of a jump start on week 7 is going to be focused on African American lit, the Harlem Renaissance. It's also going to be looking at the 1930s and some political issues. And we're also going to be shifting into what we call contemporary poetry because it does span from like the 1930s to kind of almost I guess you'd say the late 1900s. And so you can, of course, take a look at those readings and start to get yourself prepared for it. I was really super impressed with everyone's postings for week 5. I think that you all really did enjoy the readings, and I think that you're becoming much more comfortable with looking at literature and thinking about how do you ask the questions and how do you relate to it and how do you get something out of it, which is at the end of the day all literature studies really boils down to, is this kind of exploration of culture, history, ideas, symbols, concepts that we then as a reader take and make sense of and then try to make a statement or at least a proclamation about what we see operating in that text. But it is not a fixed or a hard or even a static answer. And so it does take a bit of time to get comfortable with that kind of interpretation. I just want to kind of go through, like I've been doing, your postings. Christopher posted about the Frost poems and that there was a great amount of comfort and enjoyable qualities to them, and that he really appreciated the nature. And many of you did post that you enjoyed reading Frost and he was accessible. Remember, Robert Frost was our poet laureate. In fact, when Kennedy was inaugurated, he actually was the poet, much like if you've watched any of the later inaugurations, there's always a poet, and the poet laureate usually gives a recitation, and Robert Frost was Kennedy's. And so he does have a very warm place in the popular culture and also in poetic culture too. Charlene also loved Frost, but I really, and many of you did this, but I really enjoyed Charlene's emotional involvement with Fitzgerald's Babylon Revisited. This story does take a great amount of empathy from the reader, and sometimes even anger at, what Charlie's done. But in the same vein, Charlene did mention she was emotionally involved with it. Ansley had a great reading of Fitzgerald and used The Great Gatsby as a lens to access and to critique. Fitzgerald's Babylon Revisited, which many people have argued is the logical progression or extension of what would happen to a Gatsby-type figure. Joseph had an excellent post. He really focused on the idea of pushing the envelope and really kind of looked at how the modern short story writers we've read, whether it be Catherine Ann Porter in Flowering Judas, or Ernest Hemingway, or Sherwood Anderson's Hands. He kind of focused on that pushing of the envelope. Kevin really connected well, like many of you, with Fitzgerald's character in Babylon Revisited and the idea of mistakes. And this is something, kind of very similar to what we've seen in realism and naturalism. But in modern writing, mistakes are very much a source of alienation and exile, of fragmentation and disenchantment with the society. And I really saw that in Kevin's posting. Christopher had a great background on Leda. I really appreciate you sharing your observations on that mythological and somewhat historical figure. Morgan, excellent overview of each work. She, you kind of went down each one very clearly. I really enjoyed your unbiased observations of Anderson's hands. Many of you were very torn with the main character and kind of how he kind of was persecuted but also prosecuted in many ways by his actions or his misinterpretation of his actions. Melvin had a great reading of Porter's Flowering Judas, which was an engaging story. Sherry had a great reading of Stevens' The Red Wheelbarrow, which many of you did enjoy, that 15-line poem. Philip, great imagery and reading of Hemingway's The Snows of Kilimanjaro. Like many of you, you did mention the hyena as being an avatar of death. Carrie, excellent post, and I like how you integrated biography into your reading of the creative works. That's very new historical of you, which is a school of critical theory and thought when it comes to literary studies, so good job there. Ryan, a great connection of time and the presentation of time in Fitzgerald's Babylon, and also an excellent posting. The notion of time in the modern period was shifting. We had philosopher slash, I guess you'd say, pundit Henri Bergson, who wrote about the difference between lived time and experienced time. And this did affect many of our writers, including ultimately Nabokov, who took a lot of this into account when he started writing. Juan, fantastic post. In fact, I encourage everyone to go to Juan's posting and read his interpretation of The Red Wheelbarrow. It's probably one of the better interpretations of that poem that I've seen, and it really does speak to both the personal and the kind of the overarching literary interpretation of a poem, the power of a poem. So thank you so much, Juan. Rhetoric, you had great points about Anderson's story being a critique of small town society and values, and I think that's important too, is that these pieces of literature were also being used as kind of lenses from which to make statements or make claims about things that were happening in our surrounding world. And I think that that's important to understand, that these weren't just existing as some kind of, creative bubbles, but that they were really trying to say and to make and enact change. Ashlyn, great posting. I love your use of the quote from 831 to support your views of Hemingway. I love that when you use that evidence and then you pull it into your analysis. That's exactly what you want to do, and that will always make for a strong declaration when you're engaging literature. Edmund, great reading of the poetry this week. I really appreciate your engagement. Chandra really focused on the relatability of modern writers, and Chandrea, I really appreciate that, because one of the things many people argue is that we've never left the modern period, that there's a good chunk of the population that this is where they are. They've never achieved postmodernity or any of these other moves that they say has happened. Sarah also recently posted about the growing disillusionment or alienation that she felt when reading Fitzgerald. And as I mentioned, the modern period, because of war and all these fragmentations of society, religion, gender expectations, it was a very fragmented and alienated world where people were very disillusioned with the standard practices. Jason, our great reading of Porter's Flowering Judas, I really liked your interpretation of the symbolism. Don't forget, even if it is modern, there's still symbolism operating. Jonathan, great empathetic reading of Anderson's Hands, and I like that you tied it to contemporary society and the expectations of such. Russell, great reading of Stephen's Sunday Morning. I encourage you all to take a look at that one. Quenisha, nice focus on the non-traditional breaks in Hemingway's Snows of Kilimanjaro, that kind of leaping in time, which we just talked about with Henri Bergson's lived time versus experienced time, and there is this play and shift. It's not a linear narrative. Jeremy F., I love the statement about Snows of Kilimanjaro. This is modernism, and you said, Jeremy says, life is not certain and you never know what could happen. This uncertainty is also a major tenet of modernism. Jason, great reading of Hands, and I love how you really do focus on the construct that it is all about the perspective. Emily, I am really glad to see that you're enjoying the course and that you're kind of building on the knowledge that you've got from before. That's what we hope to achieve here. I love the line that you wrote when you said he had to live such a sad life due to his hands. And that's a great way to kind of succinctly summarize Anderson's short story, Hands. And in a sense, it's kind of this sense of this observation that persecution can happen faultless or blameless, but it still kind of resides in one's personal responsibility. Forrest, I love that you mentioned your adoration of Fitzgerald and Hemingway, and that you really did focus on the idea that death is not for regrets, that it's kind of about moving beyond that. Jennifer, great focus on fragmentation in the stories. This is, as I mentioned, a large tenet of modernism. Jordan, I love that you focused on the lack of capitalization in Cummings' work and that you really connected this break with traditional kind of rules as being an indicator of modernism. And that's a great way to think about it. Jessica, great attention on the destruction and loneliness in the fiction, the sense of alienation and exile that we do feel and we do see in the works. Camelia, I love that you mentioned the concept of redemption, which is a great part of most of the moderns. You know, this search for or hope for redemptive and a redemptive experience that may or may not happen, and when it does, is it even satisfactory? Charles, great reading of Frost's work. Lindsay, I love that you mentioned Fitzgerald's desire, this desire to get his daughter back, the desire to kind of rise above his own shortcomings, which is a large part of Fitzgerald's work. Miranda, excellent post, and I love your attention to detail. For the most part, as I mentioned, these were great posts. I saw a lot of good development, and I think that at this point in the semester, once you finish the midterm, then week 7, 8, and 9 are really about just kind of enjoying the readings, getting enough of the information. There is a final, but the final is not proctored. The final is take home, open book, open note. The final is really for you to have fun with the work that we've been using and exploring in the class. If you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thanks.